Physics video. Yes, response to Holiday. I do want to make some new animations. I am working on it, but yeah, I think I'll just make this video before I wait on that. I always just draw some pictures. So anyway, he's getting some of it, but this is where he's still saying, okay, there's something missing. And yeah, I can see there's always going to be bits missing. Not always, but yeah.
These two bodies, so this is in orbit, it's got sufficient velocity that it never really gets there. If there is all these particles, the fact that it has in this diagram a transverse direction, tangential direction, will mean the effect is felt more on this side, that there will be a net force, an extra force also pushing this way, which will slow it down.
Right. So now he'll concede that that's not a problem if you understand the mechanism. And the mechanism isn't, you can't think of these bodies as things. They're not the same as these things. So these little bits are functioning differently than these big bits. These big bits are actually just little bits, and the only difference these little bits have is that they have a different directional vector. So you could say that this thing in the center, let's just say it was actually standing still, which isn't the reality of an atom, but let's just say it was in a permanent location. That would just mean that as many things are going down, that it's going up, that it's going sideways, that it's going the other way, so that there's an equal amount of net functionality in terms of directionality. So you always have to think about direction, not speed. Speed never changes. They're always just little bits moving the speed of light. So it's not about the speed of the individual bits. It's not about changing their speed to make something move. The way something moves is that more of them go in that direction. A slight number more end up going in this direction rather than this direction. Therefore, it moves in that direction. That kind of thing. More of these bits spend their time going a little bit more in this direction. I mean, obviously all the bits have to tend to be moving in that direction. So a little bit more of each one of their time, whatever spiraling they're doing, has to be in the direction that it ends up moving. And likewise with this. But there would be technically no friction to movement. It's just that these bits have a directional difference. They don't have a speed difference. They don't have an encounter difference. They're not going to hit more bits because they're moving in a specific direction. Directionality will not mean you hit more things. So it doesn't matter which direction they're going. They'll hit exactly the same number of these little bits. So it doesn't matter the bits inside this little circle. It doesn't matter which way they're going. If they all go one way, they'll hit just as much stuff as if they all go in a different direction. So the total amount of impacts will be exactly the same. And that needs to be understood. And he seems to understand that with what he says now. He's over here.
Mendon believes he answers this criticism by noting that everything is going in actual fact the same speed. And at first glance, I think it's quite a brilliant insight, though I think it's wrong.
Yeah, he's not really going to do the why it's wrong thing, though. So that's the unfortunate part.
The idea is, Mendon is saying that since this body is made up of particulates, which are in fact always going at the speed of light, however arranged, whether in circles, ellipses, so on and so forth, all going on inside, the outside forces are never really going to change the fundamental speeds.
Right, it can't change the speed. All that can happen is the direction of the bits changes. But again, doesn't matter which way you go. So back to the school of fish analogy. The fish will hit just as much stuff swimming in any direction, like as a school standing still. They'll run into just as much plankton, let's say, spinning around in circles, as they'll run into if they all go one direction. But obviously if all the fish in the school go in one direction, it'll look like something more is happening. But it's exactly the same thing if we establish that the fish never go any faster individually and that they never get any fatter. If they get no bigger, no smaller, and they stay moving exactly the same speed, just as many plankton will get hit, whether they're spinning in a circle or moving in a direction.
The problem is if they can't change the average speed in this direction disproportionately to this direction, then there isn't really an argument to say why, in the first place, they can affect in any particular direction if they can't affect the average speed.
Well, again, the fact of their, or the shape of their movement, the direction they're moving most of the time, like say an ellipse, clearly they're moving most of the time. If they're moving in some kind of stretched out circle, they're spending more of their time going that way and that way than they are going this way or that way. And in that sense, you can understand that there will be differences in potential movement. And I'm just saying all I have to do is take that principle and, create any reason why that gets altered, that tumbles. So once you begin to tumble that broken circle, so once you give it, what's the word they use for Mercury's orbit being off, it's progression. So once I give it progression, the progression will be essentially the what you perceive to be the movement of the school. It's just progressing, but internally it's all doing the same thing. Well, I'll do better explaining.
So the explanation of this, I should like to hear again, because, as I recall in Menemans, the idea of things eating space or whatever, and at this point it's fine to say we don't understand the time evolution rules.
Right. So it's okay to say it, but it doesn't mean much to you because you're saying that's the reason to critique it. But anyway, this is what I mean by the progression of the orbits. So there would be movement built into the imbalances created inside the internal movement, and those imbalances create this net change in spending more time going one way than going another way, because somehow the orbit is doing more of this and then doing this. It's actually not even a pure ellipse. It's an imbalanced ellipse. Yes, if I could say it that way. And I'll try to explain why I think that's happening. So let me just finish up here and then I'll give the short course.
Inside, except that at any particular point, they have this velocity, the speed of light. I think, just remembering now, the statement that any particular particle will change its direction without one of these impacts that I've just previously discussed.
Right. Now, I've never said that happens, so I don't believe there is anything that does anything. Nothing changes direction without being forced to change direction, so nothing changes direction without an impact.
Is a violation of conservation principles. I hope that's helped anybody to, and helps him and to see how he's.
Like I said, this was agreeable. This I never made that argument, so that I won't mess with because I don't think that's an argument I've made. So anyway,
Coming across it, so I've got to stop this video.
yeah, it's limited to 15 minutes. Anyway, so like I said, the other part of the video was basically just outlining the Sage theory and his agreement with, okay, conceptually this might work. All right, so the first thing I guess I'd establish is that there's two potential kinds of orbits, right? You have the orbit that's established by a gravity. I guess I got to find the right focal length for this camera. And then the thing goes around it, right? A center. So this would be the idea that gravity shields the pressure. It's blocking the pressure coming from this direction. It creates a low pressure here, and so the body falls into the low pressure, and so its line would have been this. Its vector is changed to this because it's getting hit more from this side than this side because of this shadow. So there's a shadow cast here. That shadow creates a higher pressure on the outside. The outside pressure knocks it off this trajectory, and it takes this trajectory instead. So that's just the standard definition of gravity. So the opposite, also a form of gravity, would be two objects, one going one way, one going the opposite direction. So you have two objects going opposite directions that would shield each other from gravity, and end up circling each other. So you'd end up with two objects circled, creating an orbit, and there would be no mass in the center. So the center of gravity would still be the center, but the center would have no mass, and the gravity would be created by the just transversed across each other. So it's just the same thing as this, except both bodies are just spinning around each other. Now the obvious tendency of this ball, this is more kind of a dumbbell kind of perception of gravity, where you have the mass on the outside, not the mass on the inside, but it still works. Now the catch is, okay, on this small level, what's happening is we have to always remember that the gravity is being caused by impacts. And so there's more impacts from the outside than there is coming from the inside because of the number of impacts that are blocked from coming this way or this way. So this shadowing effect drives the objects together, but it's really they're being pushed from because there's more pressure on the outside because of the blocked pressure on the inside. Now the catch is these objects are moving at the speed of light, and so are these objects creating what's known as the gravity. So the circumstance created by this circumstance is this awkward circumstance, where in this circumstance, this thing, by the time the gravity, this blocked gravity, got to this point would be here. So the blocked gravity would be doing it no good, because at this point, this gravity is now angular gravity. Okay, so this is where you have to kind of understand that, where these moving objects are colliding, they're going in different vector directions. So if two things again meet each other head on, at right angles, you'll end up with a right angle collision. This one will go this way, this one will go this way, and you'll end up with what look like the same thing you started with, except it'll be the other bodies that are going the other way. But you end up with the same thing. But the point is that depending on these angles of impact, you have a different vector change. So the vector gravity off of an angular impact, which would be the blocked impact where the real item will be. So when this thing is casting its gravity, this item will end up over here. So the real gravity that's getting blocked is going to be this angular block. This angular gravity over here is the one going to be the real gravity that this one's going to feel. And this one was angular, which means if the body was moving this way, it has a different, the different vector impact than if it was moving horizontally. So now the gravity is a different shape, or in the sense that it's a weaker gravity. And this would be, say, technically the stronger gravity would be from this side. So you end up with a gradation of gravity, okay, that isn't equal. It's weaker and stronger in different locations. And so this is what's going to create your highly eccentric orbit, because this body will end up moving a little further away from this body, which will tend this other body to move further away from it unless it hits a heavier gravity. And the only way it can hit a heavier gravity is it's going to have to go into the point where this one will be the next time or something, or there has to be some built-in imbalance to compensate for that. So my point would be is the whole thing will tend to fly apart because it'll never be able to hit the gravity that's the strongest. It'll always be hitting weak gravity. And the only way that you could maybe compensate for that is that if there was an imbalance in the actual number of masses in the orbit. So now if you have an orbit that has two objects and one object, that might compensate for the weakness of the fact that they're not hitting the right gravity. You know, the fact that the gravity having to go across the distance, it has to do that at the speed of light, and at the speed of light this thing has already moved in its arc, so it's not in the same position to enjoy that low pressure. And so that consequential problem may be compensated for by creating gross imbalance, where two objects on one side and one object on the other side might create enough gravity to keep pulling this one object towards the two objects in a stronger way to avoid what was happening here, where the two objects end up, like I said, they start off gravitationally connected, and with each rotation they would end up further apart and just end up losing all gravitational connection. But by imbalancing the gravitation, you could compensate for the fact that they're keep hitting weak gravity. And so the idea would be you have this idea of this would look terribly lopsided from our perspective, thinking about gravity being almost instantaneous. I mean, from our perspective, the motions that we're going are so slow, the velocities compared to the speed of light, that the fact that gravity has a slowness to it is irrelevant, because the speeds relative to it are irrelevant. But if you're going the same speed as the gravity, it becomes quite relevant. You know, that you're going to be missing the gravity. So again, the idea would be is this stronger gravity would keep pulling this in at a stronger rate, where if gravity was instantaneous, the whole thing would end up collapsing, because this smaller body would end up being pulled in by the stronger gravity being created by two objects. And so the orbit would collapse in the opposite way, where it would just collapse on itself. They would start off apart and they would just end up colliding. But that's compensated for by the fact that the gravity is slow, and so the gravity is behind the object, and so it's weak. And so this one will be having the double gravity but minus the portion of the weak gravity, so it will constantly chase the double objects. And the double objects will always be in weak gravity, so they will tend not to create a perfect circle. They won't have enough bend on them to pull them in to create a circular orbit. So there won't be enough impacts prevented, you know what I'm saying? There won't be enough impacts prevented from this side, so the downward pressure, say this correctly, there won't be enough blocked by this one from the pressure going this way. So the pressure interior will be enough, won't be enough. The weak gravity inside won't be strong enough to knock this, to create what you need for an orbit, which is this idea of knocking the object down this sufficient angle. So the amount that this one would be knocked down would be much less, so the circle it would be creating would be a much larger circle, one too big to be gravitationally held together. But the catch is this weaker object that has stronger gravity on it, because there's two objects blocking the interior pressure. So the interior pressure on this object is much stronger. So its tendency is going to be to do exactly the opposite, and essentially when it's circling, its orbit is going to tend to chase this wider orbit. So it's going to keep chasing this one as it tries to get away. It's going to move exactly in the direction that it's moving away. And so the combined orbit will just keep doing something like this. So that creates your wobble. And now what happens to that wobble depends on what kind of gravity it's in itself as a bigger field, because there could be some object over here that's casting gravity on that and trapping that in an orbit. But essentially, so my argument to you, my counter argument, is yes, not only is it all little fish, but what's creating the first orbiting objects, the smallest matter, is that it's in a gravitational circumstance where there is no gravity pushing those things together. It's the stuff that they're made out of, the same stuff. And that you have this speed problem where you can't have instantaneous effects, or what seems like instantaneous effects. So the effect that you're, like I said, again, the two objects can't have just a straightforward magnetic attraction or something, because whatever force is being applied, whatever movement they're doing, is going to move them out of the effect of the force. So it requires an imbalance to balance the imbalance. So there's an imbalance in the gravity, and to maintain some kind of relationship that doesn't collapse, there must be some counter imbalance to balance that imbalance. So what I'm basically saying is that everything has to orbit on a false center of gravity, or the orbit would fail, because of the fact that the speed of the gravity is too slow to maintain a center of gravity. So everything has to orbit on a non-center of gravity for the orbit to be maintained. And that non-center of gravity essentially creates, in any direction, once it's engaged in a direction, it will maintain that direction until some gravitational force, or some force, it has to be gravity, all forces end up being gravity, but some extra amount of fish have to hit it to stop it from moving in that direction once it's spiraling in a direction. And that's what momentum is made out of. So I hope that helped. Like I said, I hope to make an animation to kind of describe that, but it's also going to require some sort of, I'd love to computer model this stuff, because it gets a little complicated trying to figure out exactly the math of the fact that, okay, you have gravity coming in from these directions, you have something orbiting, say, this way, you know, a thing, and it's going this way, and how it is different depending on which gravity is being blocked, what kind of shielding you get at this end over here, because basically you are saying that there will be more or less force, like ideally to bend this orbit in, to force this thing not to go straight. The ideal impact is one perpendicular to the direction it wants to go. That's the ideal way to create the reaction, which is go this way, right? I mean, for the bodies to exchange. So you want the most perpendicular gravity to be the relevant gravity, to be the relevant thing blocked. Yeah, that's just such a funny way to say it, but I think you can kind of understand that all these impacts happen, but some of the impacts have meaning and some don't. Some are superfluous and some are substantial in terms of the direction exchange. And so the fewer impacts coming from this direction, obviously we're talking about the gravity cast by this object, and the gravity cast by this object would be ones that would be directly, you know, horizontal to the motion at any one point. But again, because of the delay in the casting of this gravity, the fact is that it casted it here when the object is here, which means that it was some other gravity that was applying the force, and that other gravity came at an angle that is not sufficient to apply the full vertical force needed to push the thing down into a stable orbit. So there's insufficient gravity, which means the orbit gets wider, and that creates this imbalance that you could compensate for by creating extra matter at the other gravitational focus. Again, you don't need the center of gravity, you don't have to have mass in. So first we have to establish that you understand that. And once you understand that two bodies can circulate each other without having, and have a center of gravity that doesn't have any mass in it, that their gravitational attraction can keep them together. It often happens when galaxies collide into each other. They swirl around each other, so they essentially gravitationally spiral around no mass, no extra mass, no larger mass. The two masses circle around each other. Yeah, well, I think you get what I'm saying here. So yeah, modeling that is going to be a little. I mean, that's going to take a little bit of math to figure out the progression and how much angular change in direction, how weak the change of direction is because of the delay of the gravity, because that has something to do with the distance of the orbit. So now we can establish the distance of, say, the orbit between the nucleus of an atom and the electron, and we could say how long does the gravity take to transmit from that center to the electron, and so how much of a change in angular direction would there be, and how far away would the electron end up being from the center when, and that again with this difference in the angular impact and the fact that the orbit would end up being wider, and that there has to be something to compensate for that wideness, something that will force the nucleus to move in the direction of the wider electron's orbit. So the electron's not going close enough. So then essentially you need some compensating imbalance to oblige the nucleus to chase it, essentially, because there's more mass. That there's an imbalance between the two gravities. That's the only way to say it, I think. I think it's the only way to say it. But anyway, till next time. With animations, perhaps. I don't know if that'll help or not, though. We'll see. I have to work it out, obviously, but that's the answer. I think is in the fact that the gravity is moving the same speed as the things being affected by it on the subatomic level, and that delay in speed, that fact that the speed has a consequence to an orbit, is an imbalance that has to be corrected by a second imbalance that is non-intuitive but is perfectly necessary on the level that these things are functioning.